Something that's coupled with hamstring strength slash flexibility is the ability to move the pelvis, because the hamstrings are connected to the pelvis. So, along with other things, but that's where their attachment is. And so the ability to move the pelvis in space affects how effective the hamstrings are. At the same time, how ineffective or effective, depending on how you look at it, the hamstrings are, they can also affect the ability to move the pelvis. So to be able to decouple those movements between working just hamstrings, working just pelvis, will make the coupling of the movements more efficient. So first is decoupling by just moving through the pelvis. It's called segmented bridges, and or just getting into the movements of the different parts of the spine. And if you get down here and you feel like you want something underneath your head, then put something underneath your head. And you start first with feeling kind of where your natural spinal curves are. So the back of the head, the back of the rib cage, the back of the pelvis. And kind of notice those. And you can wiggle around a little bit to find where you feel most secure, or where you feel like there's the least amount of work going on. That's your neutral for today. And then your front hip points, your anterior superior iliac spines, your ASISs, aka your hip points. You tip those back, your lower back flattens on the floor, and you tip them forward, and your lower back arches away. You kind of find that movement. And notice how it's probably coupled with also your rib cage moving. So, can you keep your rib cage really quiet and just move your pelvis? You might feel that there's a lot of pulling in your hamstrings or your glutes, or when you posteriorly tilt, when you tip the hip points back and let the lower back lengthen without trying to flatten the rest of your back into the mat too much. You might feel a lot of sensation within the lower belly and sort of the pelvic floor. So you first start with just rocking, a little bit of rocking. And I like to do this sometimes with the image of a clock face. So 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 and 9, right? Sternum is 12, pubic bone is 6, hip points are 3 and 9 respectively. We'll just moving from 6 to 12. And again, allowing, so at first you might feel that the movement's a little bit, right? When you roll down to 6, the pulls the head and it pulls the rib cage, and when you roll up to 12, it kind of pushes it. So you can find that larger movement, and then begin to isolate it so that the rib cage and the head stay really quiet as you just move your pelvis. There's no particular breath movement that's necessary here, just a smooth awareness of your breath, that your body does the breathing pretty much on its own. I mean, if the breath helps you, if you feel like inhaling and exhaling to couple with the movements, to coordinate one movement with one breath, if that's helpful for you to create a connection with this movement and how it feels in your body, then do it that way. And then maybe side to side. So sometimes when we start rolling side to side, right, the knees go too. You can create nice big movements to really feel 6 to 9, 3 to 9. And then make it smaller so the feet and legs stay as quiet as possible. And then it's just there's a channel between left hip and right hip, and you're just rolling a marble back and forth along that channel. And then you can get fancier with it. You can start to roll it around the whole clock face. And again, this might start with first just moving and really tapping into that feeling with the rest of your body, helping with your legs and the rest of your spine. And then see if you can begin to make that movement smaller. Your legs might move a little bit. And it's not necessary to keep everything completely rigid and just try to move the pelvis. It's more like a game that you're playing. How much isolation can you create? And then counterclockwise. This typically movement in itself helps with the sensation of tightness and discomfort in the lower back. Because many times when the pelvis can't move or there isn't the awareness in the body of the difference between the pelvis and the spine, the pelvis creates a foundation for the spine. And when we don't have that foundation, then the lower back tries to take over some of those functional roles in the body, which makes the lower back overworked. So sometimes being able to get this movement in the pelvis. And then you can even play with it differently. So you can go from maybe 1 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Right, and you're trying not to tip the whole clock face. You're trying just to keep the clock face pretty even and roll, and then maybe 11. It's more of a brain game now. To 5. Or roll around. So really what you're doing, what we're doing here when we do these movements, is creating a sense of awareness of the real estate of our body in the brain. So the brain is very good at mapping the places that are most familiar to it, like the hands and the lips. But some of the other areas in the body that are less available on a habitual basis, it's really clouded in the brain. It's not clear at all. So this is just creating a clarity within this area of our body in the brain. And then you can take it into beginning to feel your glutes squeeze. So your butt squeezes a little bit, your lower back presses down into the mat, and then press into the feet and begin to peel the hips up. And my rib cage, my middle rib cage is still on the mat, and then I'm gonna see if I can bring my lower rib cage down and then lift it up, a little back and forth. My lower part of my body is working. It has just enough tension to be working, and it's not overly tense, right? It's not rigid, but it's working enough to keep my hips up, to keep this idea that my sit bones are moving toward my knees and my feet feel like they're rooted. And then you can lower the ribs, back ribs, and then maybe feel like each of the vertebrae are moving down individually. My sit bones are still lifted, and then I let them come down and give a little roll to 6, and then roll up to 12. And then it's as if each vertebrae is lifting away from the floor as you come up. And then maybe each vertebrae conversely, and it might be feeling like this whole area comes down at once. That's pretty typical. We just kind of play with it. And the more we do these, the more repetitions we allow the body to have, the more clarity we begin to build in the brain. as our nervous system begins to recognize that this movement is okay and it's safe. So these segmental bridges, as we see if we can begin to isolate each of the joints within the vertebrae and lift up. And then with control, lower down. And that might be where you work for a really long time. This might be soothing, it might be frustrating. And then I like to play with pressing down with the right foot. So now the whole spinal column, if it were a channel of water, the water shifting a little bit toward the right. And then we roll up and lower down with the emphasis shifted toward the right side of the spinal column. I like to do those a couple of times. You might notice that you can lift, that you want to lift higher, or you might feel like you don't want to lift very high at all. It's about building this connection between the movement of the spine, the ability of the joints, and the space between the vertebrae. And usually we don't physically feel that type of thing, but we can begin to access the different areas and feel them more individual than as a clump. And then you can do it to the other side, to the left. So now the weight shifts a little more to the left. It's not so much that the right side lifts up, but it's just a little inside. You feel that shifting. And then you lift with the left. And you lower from the left. And you might even pay attention to the parts that seem to lift up as a unit. So I get into this lower thoracic area. You've got 12 thoracic vertebrae. And so kind of by 8-ish, they feel like they all want to move together. So then you can pause and just kind of hang out here, seeing if you can create more of a sense of internal mapping. Can you begin to separate the feeling of movement in between these vertebrae? And maybe as you move from thoracic to lumbar or in the lower back, that also there might be a bit of a hitch or a ratcheting, a shaking in the body. And hang out doing that. And then you can take it around. So, right, the legs might want to move around initially as you come down and around. That might feel good, and you might stay here, like letting the legs shift a bit, going up the right and going down the left, and then going up the left and down the right. And maybe eventually you work to the place where the legs can stay pretty quiet. Can you do this more from the spine, more from the sense of movement within the torso? How quiet can the rest of the body be? My legs feel pretty, my legs are working pretty substantially to support this movement. So it's not as if they're not moving at all, but I've created a quietness from this to more of a sense of stabilizing as best I can through the legs and channeling this movement into the spine. And then I like to widen my feet and just take my knees back and forth. I'll let the rest of the spine kind of follow around. Follow knees. And there's a whole bunch of practices that we can do with this 90-90 of the legs. But that first one of getting into the pelvis, being able to move the pelvis and follow with the rest of the spine, that's a really nice warm-up, and you might already feel that your lower back isn't quite as tight. Try that one.